And there has been concerns about the resurgence of kidnap and killing in the aftermath of the 2023 general elections in Nigeria. Former Vice President and presidential candidate of the People's Democratic Party in the 2023 general elections, Atiku Abubakar, has condemned the resurgence of killings in Nigeria, especially in Zamfara, Benue, and other parts of Nigeria. Now, more than 134 people have so far been killed in Benue State in the last 5 days across 3 local government areas of Otukpo, Akpa, and Guma, just as 10 residents were reportedly killed in Kaduna's Langson community of the Zango Kataf local government in mid-March. Similarly, Sokoto State Police Command confirmed the rise of banditry in some communities in the Guadabama local government area of the state. And the police said the situation was responsible for the rising tensions in some villages within the council area. Also, although now released, the former deputy governor of Nasarawa State, Onje Gye Wadowas, was abducted on Thursday at his residence in Gwage village, Waba, Lagos government area of the state. Now, security analyst Dr. Kabir Adamu joins us now to speak on this resurgence in banditry and other forms of violence by non-state actors in the aftermath of the general election. Good to have you, Dr. Adamu. And I would like to, first of all, ask, what do you think is directly responsible for this uptick in kidnapping, banditry, and unrest we're beginning to see brew in Nigeria?
Thank you, Aaron, and I hope you are enjoying the Easter holidays. Also, Ramadan Mubarak to our Muslim listeners. You're right. I run a consultancy, and we keep a database of security incidents. And between December and February, we saw an almost 80% of reduction in kidnap for ransom as well as other crime incidents within the country. However, sadly, from the last week of March into this first and second week of April, we've seen a resurgence of both kidnap for ransom as well as other violent criminal incidents that were recorded. Now, there are a couple of common trends that have emerged that one would say are responsible for this resurgence. The number one factor is the teen security deployment, especially in rural areas. Just before the elections, we saw massive deployment of security forces from different organizations across the country to provide the right environment for elections to hold. And a lot of these security forces have now been redeployed back to their bases, as it were. Now, the second element is the existence as well as the willingness of what we've qualified as non-state armed groups who are active, who have shown the tendency to challenge the supremacy of the use of force by the state. And in doing so, sadly, they have successfully challenged that supremacy of the use of force by the state. So where, as an example, they go to a rural area, abduct children, and then demand for ransom. Clearly, what they are saying is that, look, we don't recognize the authority of that state. What they know clearly that what they are doing is against the constitution of the state, but they still go ahead and doing it. In other words, calling the bluff of the state. Do what you like. The same thing is happening in Benue State, where consistently, in fact, it's so brazen that in one of the incidents, they went in daylight during a market day, carried out the incident, and frankly, we've not seen a commensurate response by the security forces. So clearly, they are challenging the supremacy of the use of the force by the state, and they are doing that quite successfully. This is what was happening before the elections. It kind of died down during the elections, and now we're seeing that returning to what it was. The third element is what I would describe, and I say this with all sense of authority, the willingness of the state to respond or even to take proactive measures to prevent these non-state armed groups from doing what they're doing. We saw during the Naira redesign policy when the state governors, and to an extent even at the federal level, the kind of political energy and response that it triggered. You saw state governors even going to court, challenging the federal government for that move. But we haven't seen that type of response from both the subnationals as well as some of the units within the federal government when it comes to issues that have to do with security. According to the data in my consultancy, over 300 persons have been affected within this short period from the last week of March into the first and second week of April. Now, there is no country where you have 300 citizens affected by insecurity and then you have this laid-back approach, as it were. Perhaps in the course of our conversation, we can talk about what the incoming administration has said they would do with regards to security and how I think that may help in quelling some of these issues that we're witnessing at the moment.
Now, Dr. Adamu, I would like to ask, will this be a disturbing footnote in the legacy of the outgoing president, talking about President Muhammadu Buhari? Because a lot of people expected so much, being a former general. They expected to see military might, military dexterity in full display in the course of the last almost 8 years. But that hasn't been the case. And you also mentioned something I want you to probably expatiate on. You said something about the lack of political will, that the way governors and the federal government went against each other in regards to what they deemed was sensitive and germane issues is not being reciprocated or is not being spread across different places, especially in the areas of security. Talk to us also about the political will of the governors, the president, and also the entire infrastructure of security here in Nigeria.
So it would be very unfair to, conclude and use one brush of the stroke of the brush and say, political will was lacking, and I'll explain what I mean. In the first tenure of President Buhari, he mainstreamed security. Part of the tripod focus areas that he put forward, security was one of them. And then in his second administration, as his 9 priority areas, security was also part of that. Now, that is for the executive arm of government. If you go to the legislative arm of government, in both the 9th Assembly, security was part of the legislative agenda under Bukola Saraki as well as under Senator Ahmed Lawal. So clearly, security has been mainstreamed. Now, what did that mean in reality, both at the strategic level and then at the operational level? What it meant is that the platforms, as an example, of almost all the security, law enforcement and security, armed forces have been improved. So you have the Air Force having new and, in fact, one of the best available platforms in this African subcontinent, as it were. Prior to this administration, the Air Force was almost grounded, but right now they are boasting of probably one of the best in the African subcontinent. Likewise, the other armed forces, the Navy, we can speak extensively around how issues that affected the Gulf of Guinea bases from the region with the highest rate of insecurity to now the lowest, as it were, globally. And then, of course, the ground forces. We've seen several innovative, moves and policies and measures introduced for the army, as it were. So all of this have translated into an enhanced capacity, enhanced capability. Now, we can also go down to the state governors, where I don't think there's any state in the country at the moment that does not have one or the other form of security structure in existence. We can also look at the laws governing some of these security departments, both at the federal and the state level. Sadly, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, security still remains within the exclusive list, and that means only the federal government has constitutional mandate for security. This, for me, is one of the legacies that this administration is leaving behind. We'll look back and ask ourselves, why hasn't that changed? Despite this desire by the state governors, just like I've mentioned, for them to have state-level security arrangement. So in summary, what I'm trying to say is there have been improvement in several areas. However, sadly, there have also been a lot of gaps in several areas. So as an example, we've seen the changing face of insecurity from what we understood as terrorism, which was jihadist in nature. Now we've seen a spread in terms of the areas where insecurity is affected. So from traditionally the northeast, now it's moved into some parts of north central and northwest Nigeria. We've also seen a rise in banditry, as it were, and then of course the secessionist agitation in the southeast of Nigeria and then in the southwest of Nigeria. Now what this meant is that the grievance resolution mechanism that was managed by this administration was not capable of addressing these challenges. In other words, the focus on what in security terms is called kinetic measures has certainly not been very effective, especially since we now realize that there are non-kinetic ways of addressing insecurity. In other words, what are those soft issues that have given rise, that we call the root causes of insecurity? Unemployment, poverty, climate change, political, socio-economic grievances that affect communities, even value systems that have collapsed. How have we gone about addressing that? So in looking at the legacy of the Buhari administration, I think it's absolutely important that we pick each and every one of these components and then try to score it. In some areas, it did very well, but sadly in other areas, I think there is a lot that needs to be done.
All right. You almost nailed that here, not there, but that's okay. Permit me to further prod deeper, understanding that security experts will usually say that we get to see an uptick in banditry, violence, and insecurity as we approach the election season. And shortly after, and then we begin to see it actually drop drastically after the election season. This is not the case. Because the people in Benue State will certainly feel let down by the government. Because time and time again, they've had their homes ravaged, they've had loved ones, they've had to bury loved ones time and time again. Talk to us, what is really happening? Because this pattern is completely new. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's completely new, understanding that in previous election cycles, we've seen it rise before the election and drop off after the elections. But this time around, we're beginning to see it rise again. And the elections were just over a few weeks ago.
Yeah, so it's still very early to reach that conclusion. In other words, will this level of intensity that we're seeing, will it sustain through the transition period, or is it just, as it were, a flash in the pan? The reason why I'm neither here nor there is because, I try to be factual. I've used as much as possible facts to buttress every point that I've mentioned. Every statement I made can be backed by facts. There's no reason for me to condemn what is an achievement. Where there are failures, I would say there are failures. And frankly, because government is a continuum, I expect that whatever achievements have been made by this administration would be taken up, and that's what the manifesto of the incoming administration says. It says it would build on the positive achievements of this area. And it has also mentioned a couple of other things that it would bring on board. As an example, one key point that we need to address is this ungoverned spaces. Almost all the non-state armed groups that I have mentioned, they operate in these ungoverned spaces. That is where they hibernate. That is where they come out, carry out their attacks, and then go and keep up to 100 persons. In the case in Zamfara, as an example, or even in Benue State, most of these actors operate in these ungoverned spaces. And I'm very happy that in the manifesto of the incoming administration, they've talked about some measures to reduce this ability by these non-state armed groups to operate in these ungoverned spaces. So as an example, they've talked about having forest rangers, increasing the number of forest rangers. They've talked about technology. They've talked about the use of aerial surveillance capabilities to monitor and put surveillance over this location. So all of these are positive trends that would determine whether this trend that we're seeing would remain or not. But I would also say that for this administration, it still has a couple of months. And I note that the president has given a directive to the security agencies to go after the perpetrators of the acts in Benue State. And as a Nigerian, and I'm sure every Nigerian, my blood was chilled. I was moved by the heinous nature of the crime, the types of attacks that I saw in Benue State. And that's what I expect our political leaders to do. Irrespective of their orientation, their affiliation, we should, as a people, condemn this type of atrocities. One thing that I know has sadly allowed these non-state actors to continue their act is our inability as Nigerians to disaggregate the challenges. So, as an example, the attack in Benue State, all I hear is harassment. Now, harassment is such a generic term that does not really help in identifying who the perpetrator is. We need to be very specific. And I tell you that the residents of these 3 local governments where these incidents happen, to an extent, they will know who the perpetrators are. Now, when these perpetrators
Dr. Adamu, permit me to interject at this. Dr. Adamu, permit me to interject at this point. Nomenclature does not matter when lives are being lost on a quantum level. Whether they are headsmen or bandits or thieves or whatever you call them, lives are being lost. We are in the media might decide to want to spin it one way or the other and decide to name it one way or the other. But the root cause is still the root cause, or the problem is still the problem, which is the fact that people are getting killed and people are not safe in Nigeria. So does it matter what we decide to label it?
Oh, it does, Aaron. Sadly, issues around identity, issues around labeling individuals, issues around even ethnicity that sadly permeated our political cycle. You recall what happened in Lagos when individuals of certain identity were disallowed to vote. Now, when you label perpetrators with an ethnic identity, sadly, what it creates is a division. And that division is what these perpetrators actually hide under to continue what they're doing. Now, the point I was trying to make is the kind of information we volunteer as Nigerians would also help the security agencies. If we use a generic term to just say herdsmen, it doesn't really help the security agencies, because I'm into intelligence, and if I want to run an investigation, what would help me is the 5 imperatives: who, what, when, where, and how. Now, using that word herdsmen does not in any way answer any of these imperatives. So, point I'm trying to make is, let's be a little bit more volunteering in terms of the information we share. I bet you that someone somewhere knows what is happening. Now, why that person is keeping quiet, and why, again, this is absolutely important, why the security agencies, we have 27 of them, why they are not taking ownership of this issue and problem is because we're divided in terms of these identity issues that we have allowed ourselves to fall the trap of. We need to be more volunteering in terms of the information we share, especially from the grassroots. When incidents like that happen, what triggered it? Who is behind it? Where did these people come from? Again, those 5 imperatives: who, what, when, where, and how. That is the responsibility of the security organizations. And the moment as residents of these localities, we share that information, then the media, civil society organizations, organizations like my own, would take it up, and the pressure will mount on the security organizations to go after the perpetrators. But the moment it becomes generic and a little bit vague, then that ability to put pressure on the security organizations sadly is lost.
Okay, I would not fault you on that, but some will still insist it's still academic at best. That the most important thing is security agents and the security apparatus in Nigeria rises up to defend the people. But because of time, let's press further. I would like to find out from you. This is becoming a norm. And it's unfortunate that we're hearing about this. You said you felt cold chills. But for some people, this has become a norm. It doesn't raise hairs anymore because it has happened one too many times. and it's becoming part and parcel of our daily lives, whereby we get to open the pages of newspapers or watch televisions or listen to the radio and hear that there are wanton killings in this part of the country or that part of the country. Talk to me, is this the reality of Nigeria in 2023, that all this happens? And put into context, all the amount that was spent to bring in the supposed game changer, the Tucano jets, reviewing all that has been spent over the years to ensure that we shore up our defense artilleries to be able to combat and fight this whole cancer, so to speak. Talk to us about how far we've actually been able to come. Have we made a major headway with all the game changers we're supposed to bring in? And talk to us also about the fact that this is looking like the harsh reality that this will never go away. It will always remain like this.
So with every inch of everything I represent, my entire physical being and my entire spiritual being, I reject in totality what is happening in this country. The life of every Nigerian is sacred and it must be protected. And that's what I stand for. I have spent years in security and everything I do it's get towards that. Now, sometimes I wonder, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, how many of us feel that way? At what point did we begin to accept death as an everyday reality in Nigeria? And that's what I would never accept. And I think every Nigerian should speak up against it. The tendency sometimes to say because it hasn't affected us, then we're not bothered. We wake up, we hear 80 persons abducted, we hear 100 plus persons killed, and we move on as if nothing has happened. I don't want a situation where my children, my grandchildren will look back and say, what role did I play? And so I deliberately take certain actions, including on my social media spaces and other spaces where I belong to show that this is not what I represent, and this is not what the kind of country that I belong to, that I am in, represent. So yeah, there may be some people that have accepted it as norm, but I can also tell you there is a significant number of persons who agree that this is
Dr.
not the
Adamu,
norm and should
Dr.
not
Adamu,
be the
permit
norm.
me to interject at this point.
What we should do.
The government, the body language of the government seems to be one that they are also not moved by this. They might want to lay blame here and there, or also say that, oh, you're probably stoking the fire by maybe mentioning that they were headsmen on the rest of them. But they also, from their body language, from what we get to see, they are also not moved anymore. If two people, let me try to minimize it, 2 people actually die from insecurity, their body language does not say otherwise.
So it depends on how you look at it. First off, what do we mean by the government? I gave the example earlier on that when the monetary policy, the new one, the Naira redesign policy was attempted, we saw how the political class responded. And I think it's any right-thinking person would conclude that that is not the kind of response we're seeing in the area of insecurity. So clearly, there is a lot that needs to be done by the political class. And instead of lamenting about it, I would say, what do we do between now and when this government would hand over? And then what kind of measures are we going to put in place to hold to account the incoming administration? And one of the best things we can do is to pick up their manifesto. They've released a manifesto, and I took my time to study that manifesto, and there are promises in that manifesto. So I think this is the time for us, civil society organizations, the media, and anyone who means well for Nigeria to start thinking about accountability measures on how to hold to account the promises that have been made in that document. Sadly, as it were, that's the only thing we can hold the incoming administration to account in terms of what promises it made to us, that manifesto. So take it up, go through it, develop, as it were, accountability measures. The media, as it were, fourth estate of the realm, civil society organizations. We've got significant power that we can wield. If we allow the current climate, and I say this with all sense of responsibility, we missed it under the Buhari administration. We allowed ethnicity to an extent, we allowed religion to permeate these two spaces that I've mentioned. We need to change that going into the incoming administration so that we are very practical in terms of how we hold government to account by calling in clear terms the promises that have been made. M&E is a very good mechanism. By that I mean monitoring and evaluation. Auditing is another very good mechanism. Now, a lot of these are outside our control, but through the kind of questions, through the kind of accountability measures that we hold the government to account to, we can create the right changes to ensure that the promises that have been made in that document are actually fulfilled. So my point is this: when we look at government, we shouldn't just look at government from the prism of the executive arm alone. Government is a continuum. Government also translates from the federal to the state government, and each and every one of these levels of government have a responsibility. Sadly, security remains within the exclusive list, and I think even going into post-2023, security will still remain in the exclusive list. But there are several things the subnationals can do in terms of contributing to security, and if we look at it from that prism, I think we would achieve more. So much has been done structurally to reduce the capacity of the Nigerian state to manage security. Sadly, time will not allow me to go into that, but just to give you a sense, we have a police unit that has been so fractured, and then not only just fractured, you have a police that is managed by two ministries. The Ministry of Interior is managing some components of our police, while the Ministry of Police Affairs is managing some components. It's only in Nigeria that you see that, and frankly, you cannot blame just one administration or one arm of government for that responsibility. So again, we need to take a step back, look at these critical elements, both from the point of view of strategic relevance, and some of the issues that I've mentioned, the operational challenges, and then make the necessary corrections. We, both in terms of the media and civil society organizations, have a role to play.
All right, thank you very much, Dr. Kabir Adamu, security expert, for joining us today here on Newsday.